Nobody in seat 18C looked like someone who could land a Boeing 777 when both pilots were down. Captain Jade Blackwood sat quietly with her worn paperback novel, her jeans and faded hoodie making her invisible among the business travelers and vacationers on Coastal Airways Flight 958. In 3 hours, she would be guiding 247 souls through the most dangerous emergency landing in commercial aviation history, using skills that everyone around her assumed she didn't possess. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun streamed through the small oval window as Jade settled into her middle seat, sandwiched between a chattering businessman and an elderly woman clutching a cross necklace. The familiar hum of jet engines filled the cabin of the Boeing 777 as passengers found their seats, stowed luggage, and prepared for the routine flight from Portland to Tampa. For most people aboard Flight 958, this was just another Tuesday morning journey. For Jade, it was supposed to be the start of healing. She adjusted her seatbelt with movements that were perhaps a fraction too precise, too practiced, for someone who claimed to be just another passenger. Her eyes automatically tracked the flight attendant's safety demonstration, noting details that most travelers ignored: exit rows, life vest locations, oxygen mask procedures, old habits from a life she'd tried to leave behind. "First time flying?" asked Graham Sinclair, the businessman in 18A, his expensive suit and gold watch marking him as someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. His tone carried that particular condescension reserved for people he assumed were beneath his notice. "Not exactly," Jade replied quietly, returning to her book. She had no desire to make small talk, especially not with someone whose opening gambit was to assume she was inexperienced. Sinclair chuckled. "Let me guess, maybe 3 or 4 flights in your whole life? Don't worry, these pilots know what they're doing. These big birds basically fly themselves these days." He tapped his laptop screen importantly. "I'm in aerospace consulting. I probably know more about how this plane works than the crew does." Jade bit back her response. If he only knew that she had more flight hours in military aircraft than most commercial pilots accumulated in a decade. But that was the old Jade, the one who wore captain's bars and commanded respect through skill and authority. This version of herself, the one trying to figure out what came after the military, had learned to stay invisible. The truth was, Jade Blackwood had been many things, but never ordinary. 3 years ago, she'd been Captain Blackwood, one of the few female fighter pilots to achieve ace status in combat operations. She'd flown F-22 Raptors through hostile airspace, commanded aerial missions that saved countless lives, and earned decorations that most pilots only dreamed of receiving. Her call sign had been Phoenix, for her ability to pull victory from the ashes of impossible situations. But military glory felt like someone else's life now. The transition to civilian life had been harder than any combat mission she'd ever flown. No amount of training prepared you for the suffocating normalcy of a world that didn't understand what you'd sacrificed, what you'd seen, what you'd lost. Her service medal sat in a box in her apartment closet, gathering dust while she struggled to find purpose in a society that seemed to move at a different speed than the one burned into her by years of split-second life-and-death decisions. The nightmares had started after her last deployment. Not the Hollywood version of PTSD, but something quieter and more insidious. A constant feeling of being disconnected, of watching life happen from behind bulletproof glass. Civilian jobs felt meaningless after years of missions where failure meant people died. Relationships crumbled under the weight of experiences she couldn't explain to people who'd never held someone's life in their hands at 30,000 feet. So here she was, flying to Tampa for what her therapist called a new beginning. A job interview with a small charter airline, flying rich tourists to private islands. It wasn't saving lives or defending freedom, but it was flying, and maybe that would be enough to feel human again.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking.
The intercom crackled to life with the voice of Captain Leonard Fairbanks, a veteran pilot whose steady tone immediately conveyed competence and experience. "We've been cleared for takeoff and expect a smooth flight to Tampa this morning. Flight time will be approximately 4 hours and 20 minutes with partly cloudy skies and light winds at our destination." Jade found herself automatically analyzing the captain's voice, a habit from her military days. Fairbanks sounded professional, experienced, probably in his late 50s with enough flight hours to handle anything routine that might come up. Good breath control, no signs of stress or fatigue. The kind of pilot passengers could trust with their lives. In the cockpit, she knew, First Officer Ava Sterling would be running through final pre-flight checks. Jade had noticed her during boarding, a young woman who moved with the careful precision of someone still proving herself in a male-dominated profession. Sterling looked to be in her early 30s, probably with enough experience to handle standard operations, but likely untested in real emergencies. As the Boeing 777 began its taxi toward the runway, Jade noticed details that other passengers missed. The slight vibration in the airframe that indicated a properly balanced aircraft, the sound of flaps extending as they approached takeoff position, the subtle change in engine pitch as Captain Fairbanks advanced the throttles for departure. These observations weren't conscious choices. They were the result of thousands of flight hours burned into muscle memory and instinct. Even 3 years removed from active duty, even struggling with the transition to civilian life, Jade's mind automatically cataloged every sight, sound, and sensation that might indicate the health and status of the aircraft carrying her through the sky. The elderly woman beside her, Penelope Ward, clutched her armrest as the engines spooled up for takeoff. "I hate this part," she whispered, her knuckles white with tension. "The takeoff is actually the safest part of the flight," Jade said gently, her voice carrying an authority she hadn't intended to reveal. "The pilots have done this thousands of times. You're statistically safer right now than you were driving to the airport." Penelope looked at her with surprise. "You sound like you know something about flying." Jade caught herself before revealing too much. "I've read a few books," she said, turning back to the window as the 777 accelerated down the runway. But as Portland fell away beneath them and Flight 958 climbed toward its cruising altitude of 37,000 feet, Jade couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be the routine flight everyone expected. Maybe it was instinct honed by years of military service, or maybe it was the hypervigilance that came with PTSD. But something felt different about this morning. She told herself it was just anxiety about the job interview, about stepping back into aviation after 3 years of drifting. But deep in her chest, in the place where fighter pilots learned to trust their gut over their instruments, Captain Jade Blackwood felt the first stirrings of a familiar tension, the kind that meant everything was about to change. As Flight 958 reached its cruising altitude, Jade stared out the small window at the cloud formations below, her mind drifting back to a different sky, a different time. 7 years ago, she'd been soaring through these same clouds in an F-22 Raptor, leading a squadron of fighter jets on a mission that would define her military career and ultimately destroy it. The memory came unbidden, as they always did. The crystal-clear morning over Syrian airspace, her flight of 4 Raptors providing air support for a humanitarian convoy trapped behind enemy lines. Intelligence had indicated light resistance, maybe a few outdated surface-to-air missiles. What they'd encountered instead was a sophisticated ambush that turned the sky into a nightmare of incoming fire and desperate evasive maneuvers. "Phoenix Leader, this is Phoenix 2. Her wingman's voice had crackled through the radio. "I've got multiple missile locks. We need to get out of here." But below them, the convoy was pinned down by enemy forces. 37 aid workers, doctors, and civilians who would die if Phoenix Squadron abandoned them to save themselves. Jade had made the call that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Negative, Phoenix 2. We hold position and complete the mission." What followed was 23 minutes of aerial combat that military historians would later call a masterpiece of tactical flying. Jade had led her squadron through a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire, using every trick she'd learned in 15 years of military aviation to keep her pilots alive while providing the cover fire the convoy needed to escape. She'd saved 37 lives that day. But she'd lost Phoenix 3, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, a 26-year-old pilot with a wife and newborn daughter back home. His F-22 had taken a direct hit from a missile that Jade's evasive maneuvers might have helped him avoid if she'd ordered a withdrawal instead of staying to fight. The medal ceremony had been a blur of handshakes and congratulations, Distinguished Flying Cross, Silver Star, commendations from generals who prized her tactical brilliance and moral courage, but all Jade could see was Webb's wife, holding their baby at the funeral, the question in her eyes that she was too polite to ask. Why did my husband die while you came home? That question had eaten away at Jade's confidence like acid. Every subsequent mission became an exercise in second-guessing, every tactical decision weighed down by the memory of Webb's sacrifice. Her performance reviews remained excellent, her skills as sharp as ever, but something essential had broken inside her. The instinctive confidence that made great fighter pilots great had been replaced by doubt, hesitation, and a crushing sense of responsibility for every life under her command. The final breaking point had come during a training exercise 2 years later. A routine mission that should have been straightforward, but when her student pilot made a potentially dangerous error, Jade had frozen for 3 crucial seconds. 3 seconds that in combat could have meant the difference between life and death. Her instructor abilities were questioned, her fitness for command evaluated, and ultimately she was offered a choice: accept a desk assignment or retire with full honors. She'd chosen retirement, unable to bear the thought of sending more pilots into harm's way when she was no longer sure she could bring them home safely. "Excuse me," Graham Sinclair's voice cut through her memories like a blade. He was leaning across the aisle, his expression carrying that familiar mixture of condescension and curiosity that Jade had learned to dread. "I couldn't help but notice you during the safety briefing. You were paying attention to details that most people ignore. You sure you haven't flown before?" Jade kept her voice neutral. "I've been on planes before." "Come on," Sinclair pressed, his tone suggesting he was enjoying this interrogation. "I've been flying for business for 20 years. I know the difference between someone who's nervous and someone who's observant. You were tracking the flight attendant's movements like you were memorizing emergency procedures." Before Jade could respond, the elderly woman beside her, Penelope Ward, shifted in her seat with obvious discomfort. Her breathing had become shallow, and a thin sheen of sweat was visible on her forehead, despite the cool air condition. "Are you feeling all right, ma'am?" Jade asked, her military training automatically kicking in to assess and respond to someone in distress. "I'm fine, dear," Penelope replied, but her voice was strained. "Just a little anxiety about flying. It always gets to me once we're in the air." Jade noticed the symptoms immediately: rapid breathing, pale complexion, trembling hands. Classic signs of a panic attack, but in someone Penelope's age, it could also indicate something more serious. Her medical training from the military had taught her to recognize the difference between anxiety and genuine medical emergencies. "Take slow, deep breaths," Jade instructed gently, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to calm the older woman automatically. "In through your nose, hold for 3 counts, then out through your mouth. Focus on my voice and try to relax your shoulders." The technique worked, and within minutes, Penelope's breathing had returned to normal. But Graham Sinclair was now staring at Jade with undisguised suspicion. "Medical training too?" he asked, his tone suggesting he thought he'd caught her in some kind of deception. "Basic first aid," Jade replied, which was technically true. The fact that her basic first aid included combat medical training and experience treating wounded pilots under fire was information she saw no need to share. "Right," Sinclair said, clearly not believing her. So you're just a regular passenger who happens to know advanced breathing techniques and pays attention to safety procedures like you're planning to use them? Jade turned back to her window, hoping he would drop the subject. But men like Graham Sinclair rarely let go of puzzles they couldn't solve, especially when they involved women who didn't fit into their preconceived categories. The truth was, Jade had been trying for 3 years to figure out who she was supposed to be now. The military had given her identity, purpose, a clear chain of command, and defined objectives. Civilian life offered none of those things. It was all choices without consequences, or consequences without clear choices. Jobs that seemed meaningless after years of missions where success meant people lived, and failure meant they didn't. She'd tried working for defense contractors, but the corporate politics and profit motives felt like a betrayal of everything she'd fought for. She'd considered law enforcement, but the idea of carrying a gun again made her stomach clench with memories of Webb's funeral. Teaching had appealed to her briefly, until she realized she couldn't bear the thought of being responsible for shaping young minds when she couldn't even trust her own judgment anymore. The job interview in Tampa was her last attempt to find something that felt meaningful. A small charter airline that specialized in medical evacuations and emergency transport. It wasn't military service, but it was flying with purpose, using her skills to help people in crisis situations. Maybe it would be enough to quiet the voice in her head that kept asking what Webb had died for. Flight attendant Ruby Fletcher appeared in the aisle, her professional smile masking what Jade recognized as mild concern. "Is everything all right over here? I noticed some movement." Mrs. Ward had a moment of anxiety. She's feeling better now. Ruby's eyes lingered on Jade for a moment, taking in details that most passengers wouldn't have noticed. The way Jade's posture remained alert, even in relaxation. The automatic sweep of her gaze that continuously monitored the cabin environment. And the calm competence with which she'd handled Penelope's distress. "Thank you for helping," Ruby said, her tone carrying a note of professional recognition. "Are you in healthcare?" Before Jade could answer, Graham Sinclair jumped in. "That's what we're all trying to figure out. Our mysterious passenger here seems to know a little bit about everything, but won't tell us what she actually does for a living." Ruby's expression shifted to mild disapproval at Sinclair's pushiness, but she remained professional. "Well, whatever your background, thank you for assisting Mrs. Ward. Can I get anyone anything to drink?" As Ruby moved on to serve other passengers, Jade closed her eyes and tried to push away the memories that flying always brought back. The sound of jet engines was too similar to the F-22's turbofan, the altitude and speed too reminiscent of combat missions. Even in the safety of a commercial airliner, her body remained on alert, scanning for threats that existed only in her mind. She didn't know yet that in less than 2 hours, those combat instincts and that hypervigilance would be the only thing standing between 247 passengers and disaster. For now, she was just another passenger trying to escape her past, unaware that her past was about to become everyone's salvation. 2 hours into Flight 958, the Boeing 777 was cruising smoothly at 37,000 feet through scattered clouds that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Most passengers had settled into the rhythm of a long flight, business travelers typing on laptops, families entertaining restless children, elderly passengers dozing in their seats. The cabin hummed with the quiet efficiency of modern aviation, a testament to decades of technological advancement and safety protocols. But Jade Blackwood couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It started with small things, details that most passengers would never notice, but that her military training had conditioned her to observe. The subtle change in engine pitch during the last 20 minutes, barely perceptible but consistent with a minor adjustment in throttle settings. The way First Officer Ava Sterling had walked through the cabin 30 minutes earlier, her professional smile not quite masking a tension in her shoulders that suggested concern about something in the cockpit. Most telling was Captain Leonard Fairbanks himself. Jade had been watching the cockpit door during the brief moments when flight attendants passed through, catching glimpses of the flight deck during those few seconds when the door remained open. Fairbanks had removed his uniform cap, which wasn't unusual, but he'd also been rubbing his left temple repeatedly, a gesture that in Jade's experience indicated either fatigue or the beginning of a headache. "You're doing it again," Graham Sinclair said, his voice cutting through her observations. He'd been watching her for the past hour with the persistence of someone who enjoyed solving puzzles, especially when those puzzles involved people he couldn't immediately categorize. "Doing what?" Jade asked, though she already knew what he meant. "That thing where you scan the cabin like you're looking for threats. Most people read magazines or watch movies on long flights. You sit there like you're conducting some kind of surveillance operation." Penelope Ward, who had been quietly knitting since her earlier panic attack, looked up with interest. "I have noticed that too, dear. You have very alert eyes. My late husband was in the Navy, and he used to do the same thing. Always watching, always aware of everything going on around him." Jade felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Civilians who'd been married to military personnel often developed an intuition about recognizing others who'd served. It was something in the posture, the way they carried themselves, the constant low-level awareness that never quite turned off, even years after leaving active duty. "I'm just naturally observant," Jade said, hoping to deflect further questions. But Sinclair wasn't satisfied with deflection. "Come on, natural observation doesn't include knowing advanced medical techniques and analyzing aircraft systems. I've been watching you, and you've been tracking every sound this plane makes like you understand exactly what each one means." Before Jade could respond, Flight Attendant Ruby Fletcher approached their row with the practice efficiency of someone who'd been handling passenger service for years. But Jade noticed immediately that Ruby's usual professional demeanor had shifted slightly. Her smile was just a fraction too bright, her movements just a touch more deliberate than they had been earlier in the flight. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ruby announced to the cabin, "Captain Fairbanks has asked me to inform you that we're experiencing some minor turbulence ahead. Please return to your seats and ensure your seatbelts are fastened. We should be through this weather system within the next 30 minutes. The announcement itself was routine, the kind of precautionary message passengers heard on dozens of flights every year. But Jade's trained ear caught something in Ruby's tone that suggested this wasn't entirely accurate. The subtle emphasis on minor, the slight hesitation before turbulence, and most importantly, the fact that the skies outside remained completely clear with no visible weather formations ahead. As Ruby moved on to check other passengers, Jade noticed her exchange a quick glance with flight attendant Quinn Davis near the galley. It was a brief moment of eye contact, but it carried the weight of shared concern about something passengers weren't being told. "Did you catch that?" Sinclair asked quietly, leaning closer to Jade. For the first time since takeoff, his condescending tone had been replaced by genuine concern. That didn't sound like a standard turbulence warning. Jade nodded slowly. "The skies are clear. No visible weather formations that would cause turbulence at this altitude." "So, what do you think?" Sinclair began. But he was interrupted by a subtle change in the aircraft's flight pattern. The Boeing 777 banked slightly to the left, a gentle course correction that could have been routine navigation. But Jade felt it in her bones, the way the aircraft hesitated for just a moment before responding to the control input, suggesting the maneuver hadn't been as smooth as it should have been.
Penelope looked up from her knitting with alarm. "Are we turning around? I thought we were flying straight to Tampa." "Probably just normal air traffic control routing," Jade said. But her instincts were screaming that nothing about this was normal. In her years of military flying, she'd learned to trust the subtle signs that preceded major problems. Equipment didn't usually fail catastrophically without warning. There were always small indicators, minor anomalies that built up over time before erupting into full emergencies. The intercom crackled to life again, but this time it was First Officer Sterling's voice instead of Captain Fairbanks. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Sterling. We're making a slight course adjustment to avoid some weather systems ahead. We expect to arrive in Tampa approximately 15 minutes later than originally scheduled. Thank you for your patience." Jade felt every muscle in her body tense. First Officer Sterling's voice carried stress markers that were invisible to untrained ears, but clear as warning bells to someone with Jade's background. The younger pilot was trying to project confidence, but underneath the professional delivery was the unmistakable tension of someone dealing with a situation beyond normal parameters. More concerning was the fact that it was Sterling making the announcement instead of Captain Fairbanks. In her experience, senior pilots typically handled passenger communications during any situation that deviated from standard procedures. The fact that the captain had delegated this responsibility suggested he might be dealing with more pressing concerns in the cockpit. 15-minute delay, Sinclair muttered, for weather that doesn't exist. And why is the co-pilot making announcements instead of the captain? Jade was beginning to appreciate that, despite his abrasive personality, Graham Sinclair was more observant than most passengers. His background in aerospace consulting might be making him more sensitive to irregularities in flight operations. Maybe the captain is busy with navigation, Jade suggested, though she didn't believe it herself. Or maybe he's dealing with something they don't want to tell us about, Sinclair replied grimly. As if summoned by their conversation, flight attendant Theo Jameson appeared in the aisle, his usually calm demeanor showing cracks around the edges. Jade watched him carefully as he moved through the cabin, ostensibly checking on passengers, but actually conducting what looked like a discreet head count and status assessment. When Theo reached their row, Jade made a decision that would later prove crucial. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "Is everything all right? The crew seems a bit more attentive than usual." Theo's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing genuine concern underneath. "Everything's fine," he said, but his eyes told a different story. "Just some minor technical issues that require additional attention from the flight crew." "Technical issues?" Sinclair pressed. "What kind of technical issues?" "Nothing that affects flight safety," Theo replied quickly, but Jade caught the way his gaze flickered toward the cockpit door. "If you'll excuse me, I need to continue checking on other passengers." As Theo moved away, Jade noticed him stop at several other rows to have similar conversations with passengers who looked like they might have aviation experience or professional backgrounds that would make them more likely to notice irregularities. He was clearly following instructions to gauge passenger awareness and potentially identify anyone who might be able to assist if the situation deteriorated. The realization hit Jade like a physical blow. The crew was conducting a discreet assessment of passenger capabilities because they were facing a problem serious enough that they might need help from anyone with relevant experience. In her military career, she'd seen similar preparations during missions when backup plans and contingency resources were being evaluated. "We're in trouble," she said quietly, more to herself than to her seatmates. "What kind of trouble?" Penelope asked, her knitting forgotten as she looked between Jade and Sinclair with growing alarm. Jade strutted the cabin around them, noting details that painted a picture of controlled crisis management. Flight attendants positioned strategically throughout the aircraft, emergency equipment checks being conducted under the guise of routine service, and subtle changes in crew behavior that suggested they were following emergency protocols while trying to avoid passenger panic. The realization hit Jade like a physical blow. The crew was conducting a discreet assessment of passenger capabilities because they were facing a problem serious enough that they might need help from anyone with relevant experience. In her military career, she'd seen similar preparations during missions when backup plans and contingency resources were being evaluated. "We're in trouble," she said quietly, more to herself than to her seatmates. "What kind of trouble?" Penelope asked, her knitting forgotten as she looked between Jade and Sinclair with growing alarm. Jade studied the cabin around them, noting details that painted a picture of controlled crisis management. Flight attendants positioned strategically throughout the aircraft, emergency equipment checks being conducted under the guise of routine service, and subtle changes in crew behavior that suggested they were following emergency protocols while trying to avoid passenger panic. The crisis was coming, and despite 3 years of trying to leave her military identity behind, Captain Jade Blackwood was about to discover that some responsibilities never truly end. The first sign that Flight 958 was about to become a nightmare came at 2:47 p.m. when Captain Leonard Fairbanks pressed his hand against his left temple and felt the world begin to tilt sideways. He was reviewing weather reports on his tablet when the familiar headache that had been building for the past hour suddenly intensified into something far more sinister. "Ava?" he said to First Officer Sterling, his voice carrying a note of confusion that made her look up immediately from her navigation display. "I'm feeling a bit off." Sterling turned toward him with concern. At 32, she had logged over 3,000 flight hours, but most of that experience was in routine operations. Emergency situations were still theoretical exercises for her, scenarios practiced in simulators, but never encountered in real life. "Off how, Captain?" Fairbanks tried to focus on her face, but his vision seemed strangely fragmented, as if he were looking at her through a broken mirror. The left side of his body felt heavy, disconnected, like it belonged to someone else. I think I need you to take the controls." Those words sent ice through Sterling's veins. In all her years of flying, she had never heard a captain voluntarily relinquish command mid-flight, except during routine training exercises. "Captain, are you experiencing chest pain? Shortness of breath?" "No, it's not my heart," Fairbanks said, his speech slightly slurred in a way that made Sterling's blood run cold. "Something's wrong with my... He struggled to find the word, his normally articulate mind suddenly grappling with concepts that should have been automatic. Sterling immediately activated the cockpit intercom. "Flight attendants to the cockpit, immediately." Her voice remained professional, but underneath the calm exterior, panic was beginning to build. She had trained for mechanical failures, weather emergencies, even terrorist scenarios. But a medical emergency involving the captain was something different entirely. Within seconds, Theo Jamison appeared at the cockpit door. His experience as senior flight attendant had taught him to recognize crisis situations immediately, and one look at Captain Fairbanks told him everything he needed to know. "Medical emergency," Sterling said tersely. "The captain is experiencing symptoms that could be neurological. I need you to find out if we have any medical professionals on board and prepare for potential emergency protocols." Fairbanks tried to speak again, but the words came out jumbled, his tongue refusing to cooperate with his brain's commands. His left arm had gone completely numb, and when he tried to reach for his water bottle, his hand barely responded to his mental instructions. "Captain, I need you to try to stay calm," Sterling said, her pilot training warring with human terror as she realized the magnitude of what was happening. "Theo, get Dr. Price from first class. Tell him we need immediate medical assistance in the cockpit." In the passenger cabin, the subtle changes in aircraft behavior that Jade had been monitoring suddenly became much more pronounced. The autopilot systems were maintaining level flight, but there was a different quality to the way the aircraft responded to minor course corrections, suggesting that manual inputs from the cockpit had ceased. "Something's definitely wrong," Graham Sinclair said, his aerospace consulting background allowing him to interpret the aircraft's behavior in ways that most passengers couldn't. "The flight pattern has changed. We're not following normal commercial air traffic routing anymore." Jade nodded grimly. Through the small cabin window, she could see that they were beginning a gradual descent, barely perceptible to untrained eyes, but unmistakable to someone with her flight experience. "We're losing altitude. Very slowly, but consistently." Penelope Ward looked between them with growing alarm. "What does that mean? Are we going to crash?" Before either of them could respond, the cabin intercom crackled to life with an announcement that sent shockwaves through the aircraft. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Sterling. We are experiencing a medical emergency that requires the immediate assistance of any medical professionals on board. If you are a doctor, nurse, or paramedic, please identify yourself to the nearest flight attendant immediately." The announcement hit the cabin like a physical blow. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, children's laughter died away, and 247 passengers suddenly understood that their routine flight had become something far more serious. Dr. Felix Hartwell, a cardiologist in first class, was already moving toward the cockpit when Sterling finished speaking. But as he passed through the business section, Jade noticed something that made her stomach clench with dread. Dr. Hartwell looked to be in his 70s, moving with the careful steps of someone whose own physical capabilities were limited by age. "Oh, God," Sinclair whispered, following Jade's gaze. "Please tell me that's not the only medical professional on this plane?" The cabin erupted in nervous chatter as passengers began to process the implications of the announcement. Parents pulled children closer, business travelers abandoned their laptops to stare anxiously toward the cockpit, and elderly passengers like Penelope Ward began to show visible signs of panic.
Flight attendant Ruby Fletcher appeared in the aisle, her professional composure barely masking obvious distress. "I need to ask all passengers to remain in your seats with seatbelts fastened. We are following emergency protocols, and I need everyone to stay calm and follow instructions." "What kind of medical emergency?" demanded a passenger from across the aisle. "Is it contagious? Are we all in danger?" Ruby's training had prepared her for many scenarios, but explaining that the pilot might be incapacitated without causing mass panic was not among them. "I can't provide specific details, but I want to assure everyone that we have qualified personnel addressing the situation." Jade watched Ruby's face carefully and saw something that confirmed her worst fears. The flight attendant's eyes kept flickering toward the cockpit with the kind of concern that suggested the situation was far more serious than a passenger medical emergency. This was something that threatened the entire flight. In the cockpit, Dr. Hartwell was conducting a rapid assessment of Captain Fairbanks, while First Officer Sterling tried to manage both the medical crisis and the increasing complexity of flying the aircraft alone. "Classic signs of stroke," Dr. Hartwell said grimly, checking Fairbanks's pupil response and motor functions. "Left side weakness, speech difficulties, facial drooping. This is a major cerebrovascular event, and he needs immediate hospitalization." Sterling felt the blood drain from her face. "Doctor, I need to know, is there any possibility he could recover enough to assist with flying the aircraft?" Dr. Hartwell looked at her with the gravity of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "First Officer, this gentleman is not going to be piloting anything for months, if ever. His condition could deteriorate rapidly, and he needs emergency medical intervention that we can't provide at 35,000 feet." The words hit Sterling like a physical blow. She was now solely responsible for a Boeing 777 carrying 247 souls, facing weather systems ahead that would require navigation skills she'd never had to use without supervision. Her hands began to shake as the magnitude of the responsibility settled on her shoulders. "We need to declare an emergency and get this aircraft on the ground immediately," she said, reaching for the radio controls. "First Officer Sterling, to any air traffic control facility, this is Coastal Airways Flight 958 declaring a medical emergency. We have an incapacitated captain and are requesting immediate vectors to the nearest suitable airport for emergency landing." The response came back immediately from Atlanta Center. "Coastal Airways 958, Atlanta Center. We copy your emergency declaration. What is the nature of the medical emergency and what assistance do you require?" Sterling's voice remained steady through years of training, but everyone listening could hear the underlying tension. "Atlanta Center, our captain has suffered what appears to be a stroke and is completely incapacitated. I am a qualified first officer, but I have limited experience with emergency procedures and weather navigation without supervision." There was a pause on the radio that seemed to last forever before Atlanta Center responded. "Coastal Airways 958, we understand. We're vectoring you toward Jacksonville International Airport, which has full emergency medical facilities. Distance approximately 180 miles. We're also contacting airline operations to provide additional support." In the passenger cabin, those close enough to the cockpit had heard fragments of the radio communication, and word was spreading through the aircraft like wildfire. The captain was down, the co-pilot was struggling, and they were facing an emergency landing with uncertain outcomes. Jade felt her military training automatically engaging as she processed the crisis. An incapacitated captain, an inexperienced co-pilot, weather systems ahead, and 247 lives hanging in the balance. It was exactly the kind of impossible situation that her years of combat flying had prepared her to handle. But she was just a passenger now, wasn't she? Someone trying to leave her military identity behind and find a normal civilian life. Getting involved would mean revealing her background, accepting responsibility, and potentially failing in a way that would haunt her forever. As Flight 958 began its emergency descent toward Jacksonville, Jade Blackwood faced the defining choice of her post-military life. She could remain anonymous and hope that First Officer Sterling could handle the situation alone, or she could step forward and risk everything to help save the people around her. The decision was about to be made for her.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The Boeing 777 shuddered through moderate turbulence as First Officer Ava Sterling struggled with controls that suddenly felt foreign in her hands. Without Captain Fairbanks' steady presence beside her, the cockpit seemed to have grown larger and more intimidating, filled with instruments and systems that demanded expertise she wasn't sure she possessed. Jacksonville approach, Coastal Airways 958. Sterling's voice cracked slightly as she keyed the radio. We're beginning our descent, but I'm encountering some difficulty with the weather system ahead. I have limited experience with manual approach in these conditions. The response from Jacksonville Tower carried professional concern. Coastal 958, we understand your situation. We're vectoring other traffic away from your approach path and have emergency vehicles standing by. Can you maintain current heading and descent rate? Sterling stared at the weather radar display showing a line of thunderstorms between their current position and Jacksonville International. In normal circumstances, Captain Fairbanks would have navigated around the weather system using decades of experience and intuitive understanding of atmospheric conditions. Now that responsibility fell entirely on her shoulders. I think so, she replied, hating how uncertain she sounded on a frequency that other pilots could monitor. But I may need guidance for weather avoidance. In the passenger cabin, the tension had become suffocating. Word had spread throughout the aircraft that Captain Fairbanks was unconscious and that the young co-pilot was now solely responsible for their lives. Parents held children tighter, passengers gripped armrests with white knuckles, and conversations had dropped to anxious whispers. Jade watched the drama unfolding with the analytical detachment that had served her well in combat situations. First Officer Sterling was competent but inexperienced, exactly the kind of pilot who could handle routine operations but might struggle with the complex decision-making required during emergencies. The weather ahead would require navigation skills that typically took years to develop, and Sterling's radio communications suggested she was already operating at the edge of her capabilities. "This is bad, isn't it?" Penelope Ward asked quietly, her knitting abandoned in favor of clutching her cross necklace. "That poor young woman in the cockpit sounds terrified." Graham Sinclair had been monitoring the radio chatter through an aviation app on his phone, his aerospace consulting background allowing him to interpret the technical communications. "She's requesting guidance for weather navigation in a Boeing 777? That's not something you learn from a manual." Jade felt the familiar weight of command responsibility settling on her shoulders, the same feeling she'd experienced countless times when faced with impossible tactical situations. Every instinct she'd developed through 15 years of aviation was screaming that First Officer Sterling was about to encounter conditions that would overwhelm her training and experience. The aircraft banked left as Sterling attempted to navigate around the storm system, but the maneuver was hesitant, uncertain. Jade could feel in the aircraft's response that the pilot was making small corrections rather than committing to decisive course changes, exactly the kind of tentative flying that could become dangerous in deteriorating weather conditions. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Sterling." The intercom announcement carried barely controlled stress that made every passenger sit up with alarm. "We're encountering some weather conditions that are requiring additional navigation around storm systems. This may extend our approach time to Jacksonville by approximately 30 minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." 30 minutes. Jade knew from her military experience that weather systems could change dramatically in 30 minutes, turning manageable conditions into life-threatening situations. First Officer Sterling was buying time she might not have, hoping for conditions to improve rather than making the hard decisions that emergency situations demanded. "She doesn't know what she's doing," Sinclair said bluntly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood aviation systems. 30 minutes of flying around thunderstorms in a commercial airliner with an inexperienced pilot? That's not a plan, that's a prayer. Ruby Fletcher appeared in the aisle again, her professional demeanor cracking under the strain of managing passenger anxiety while dealing with her own fears about the flight's outcome. I need everyone to remain calm and trust that our flight crew is handling the situation professionally. What flight crew? Demanded a passenger from the back of the plane. We heard the captain is unconscious and the co-pilot is barely out of flight school. Ruby's face flushed with the effort of maintaining composure. Our first officer is fully qualified and trained for these situations. We also have ground support providing guidance.
But Jade could see the truth in Ruby's eyes. The flight attendant knew they were in serious trouble, facing conditions that their available pilot wasn't equipped to handle. Ground support could provide vectors and weather information, but they couldn't fly the aircraft or make the split-second decisions that emergency landings required. Another passenger, a businessman in his 50s, stood up despite the seatbelt requirement. "I don't care what anyone says. If that pilot can't handle this situation, we're all going to die. Isn't there anyone else on this plane who can fly?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. And Jade felt 247 pairs of eyes searching the cabin for salvation that didn't exist. Commercial aviation regulations required that passengers remain in their seats during emergencies, trusting their lives to crew members whose qualifications were assumed rather than verified. But regulations were written for normal circumstances, not for situations where the qualified personnel were incapacitated and lives hung in the balance. "What about military personnel?" the businessman continued desperately. "Don't they teach pilots to fly in the military? There has to be someone on this plane who knows more about flying than a scared kid in the cockpit." Jade felt her throat constrict as the conversation moved dangerously close to exposing her background. For 3 years, she'd worked to remain invisible, to blend into civilian life and avoid the recognition that came with her military service. Revealing her identity now would mean accepting responsibility for outcomes she might not be able to control. But as she looked around the cabin at the faces of people who were depending on someone, anyone, to save them, she felt the ghost of Marcus Webb sitting beside her. Her wingman, who died because she'd made a tactical decision that prioritized mission success over individual safety. Webb, who'd trusted her judgment and paid for it with his life. "I can't do this again," she whispered to herself, the words barely audible above the engine noise. Penelope Ward, sitting close enough to hear, looked at her with confusion. "Can't do what again, dear?" Jade closed her eyes and saw Webb's wife at the funeral, holding their baby daughter who would grow up without a father. She felt the crushing weight of command decisions that turned living, breathing people into acceptable losses in service of larger objectives. But then, she opened her eyes and saw different faces. Penelope Ward, clutching her cross and trusting that someone would bring her home to whatever family waited in Tampa. The mother with 2 young children 3 rows ahead, trying to keep them calm while her own face showed raw terror. Graham Sinclair, despite his abrasive personality, looking at her with something approaching hope because he'd recognized that she was different from other passengers. The aircraft shuddered through another bout of turbulence, and Sterling's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some difficulty with our approach path. I need everyone to prepare for the possibility of extended maneuvering as we work with ground control to find the safest route to landing." Extended maneuvering, military euphemism for, "I don't know what I'm doing and we're running out of options." Jade stood up. The simple act of rising from her seat felt like crossing a bridge she'd been avoiding for 3 years. Around her, passengers looked up with desperate hope, as if her movement alone suggested some kind of solution to their impossible situation. Graham Sinclair grabbed her arm. "Do you know something about flying? Because if you do, now would be a really good time to speak up." Jade looked down at him, then around the cabin at the faces of people who would die if First Officer Sterling couldn't navigate the storm system ahead. People who had no say in the tactical decisions that would determine whether they lived or died, just as Marcus Webb had trusted her judgment in that Syrian airspace 7 years ago. The difference was that this time, failure meant everyone died together. There would be no survivors to carry guilt, no funeral services where widows asked unspoken questions about command decisions, just 247 people who would become statistics in an aviation disaster report. "I need to talk to the flight crew," Jade said, her voice carrying an authority that made every nearby passenger look up with sudden attention. Ruby Fletcher, who had been trying to manage passenger anxiety while dealing with her own terror, looked at Jade with desperate hope. "Are you qualified to help with aviation emergencies?" Jade took a deep breath, feeling her carefully constructed civilian identity beginning to crack under the pressure of moral necessity. "I have some experience with emergency flight operations."
It was the understatement of her life, but it was enough. Ruby's professional training warred with desperation before desperation won. "Come with me," Ruby said, leading Jade toward the cockpit. As they walked through the cabin, Jade felt the weight of 247 lives settling on her shoulders. Behind her, she could hear Sinclair explaining to other passengers that the woman from row 18 might be their salvation, though he had no idea what qualifications she actually possessed. The cockpit door opened and Jade stepped through into her past.
The cockpit of Flight 958 was a scene of controlled chaos that Jade recognized immediately from her military experience. First Officer Ava Sterling sat in the left seat, her hands gripping the controls with the white-knuckled desperation of someone operating beyond her comfort zone. Captain Leonard Fairbanks lay unconscious in the right seat, his breathing labored but stable under Dr. Felix Hartwell's watchful care. But what caught Jade's attention immediately was the weather radar display showing a wall of thunderstorms directly ahead, a line of severe weather that would challenge even experienced pilots under normal conditions. "Who is this?" Sterling asked sharply, turning to see Jade entering the cockpit. Her stress was evident in every line of her body, and the addition of another person in her already overwhelming situation clearly felt like an intrusion rather than assistance. Ruby Fletcher stepped forward. "This passenger says she has experience with emergency flight operations. Given our situation, I thought, I don't need another passenger telling me how to do my job," Sterling interrupted, her voice carrying the defensive edge of someone pushed beyond their limits. "I'm a qualified first officer, and I can handle this situation." Jade studied the instrument panel quickly, her military training allowing her to process multiple data streams simultaneously. Altitude, 28,000 feet and descending. Airspeed, slightly high for current conditions. Weather radar showing severe precipitation and turbulence ahead that would require immediate course correction. "First Officer Sterling," Jade said quietly, her voice carrying the calm authority that had served her through countless combat missions. "I'm Captain Jade Blackwood, United States Air Force retired. I have over 3,000 hours in high-performance aircraft and extensive experience with emergency navigation and adverse weather operations." The words hit the cockpit like a physical force. Dr. Hartwell looked up from his patient with surprise. Ruby's eyes widened with relief, and Sterling's defensive posture wavered as she processed what she just heard. "Air Force? What kind of aircraft?" "F-22 Raptors primarily, but I'm qualified on multiple platforms including transport aircraft with similar avionics to this Boeing 777. Jade replied, moving closer to examine the navigation display. "I can see you're facing a severe weather system that's going to require immediate course deviation." Sterling's hands remained locked on the controls, but Jade could see the conflict in her eyes. Pride warred with desperation as she realized she was being offered help by someone whose qualifications far exceeded her own. The regulations don't allow for civilian passengers to operate commercial aircraft," Sterling said weakly, grasping for procedural guidelines that seemed inadequate in their current crisis. "The regulations also assume you have a qualified captain available. Right now, you're dealing with conditions that require 2 experienced pilots, and you're doing it alone. I'm not trying to take over your aircraft, but I can provide the assistance you need to get these people home safely." Jacksonville approach crackled through the radio. "Coastal 958, we show you approaching severe weather. Recommend immediate deviation to heading 180 degrees. Sterling reached for the radio but hesitated, her inexperience with manual weather navigation evident in her uncertainty. Jade watched her struggle with the decision and recognized the paralysis that could prove fatal in emergency situations. "May I?" Jade asked, gesturing toward the radio. Sterling nodded, relief evident despite her reluctance to admit she needed help. "Jacksonville approach. Coastal 958. We are initiating immediate deviation to 180 degrees, request vectors around the weather system, and updated approach information for emergency landing." "Coastal 958, Jacksonville. Turn right to heading 220 degrees, descend and maintain 15,000 feet. We're showing clear air on that routing. What is your current flight crew status?" Jade looked at Sterling, who nodded for her to continue. "Jacksonville, we have an incapacitated captain and are receiving assistance from qualified military personnel on board. First Officer Sterling remains pilot in command, but we have additional expertise available for this emergency approach." There was a pause before Jacksonville responded. "Understood, Coastal 958. We're coordinating with your airline operations center and have emergency vehicles standing by. Continue present heading and report when ready for approach briefing." As Jade helped Sterling execute the course change, she could feel the aircraft responding to more confident control inputs.
The Boeing 777 banked smoothly to the right, avoiding the worst of the storm system while maintaining stable flight parameters. "How did you know to request that specific routing?" Sterling asked, her voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than defensive challenge.
Weather systems have patterns, Jade explained, monitoring the radar display. The severe precipitation is moving northeast, which means the southern approach will give us the best chance of clear conditions for landing. In military operations, we often had to navigate around hostile weather with minimal ground support. Dr. Hartwell looked up from Captain Fairbanks. His condition is stable but unchanged. He needs immediate hospital treatment, but he's not in immediate danger of cardiac arrest. How long do we have before his condition could deteriorate? Jade asked, her military training automatically assessing all variables that could affect their mission. Difficult to say with stroke cases, Dr. Hartwell replied. Could be hours, could be minutes. The sooner we get him to a stroke center, the better his chances of recovery. Sterling was beginning to show signs of the relief that comes with sharing overwhelming responsibility. Captain Blackwood, what's your assessment of our approach options? Jade studied the navigation display, considering factors that Sterling's commercial training hadn't prepared her to evaluate. The weather system is moving, but slowly. We can execute a standard approach from the south if we maintain current course and descent rate. The challenge will be transitioning from autopilot to manual control for landing. I've done manual landings in simulators, Sterling said, then added quietly, but never in actual emergency conditions. Simulators are excellent training, Jade replied diplomatically. But emergency landings require adjustments that you can't practice in controlled environments. The aircraft may respond differently due to stress on the systems, weather conditions, and the psychological pressure of knowing lives depend on your performance. Ruby Fletcher had been listening to the exchange with growing confidence. Should I inform the passengers that we have additional qualified assistants in the cockpit? Jade considered the question carefully. Tell them we have additional expertise available, but emphasize that First Officer Sterling remains in command. We don't want to undermine her authority or create confusion about who's making the final decisions. As Ruby left to update the passengers, Sterling looked at Jade with something approaching gratitude. I've never been in a situation like this. Commercial aviation training focuses on following procedures and relying on systems. This feels different. Emergency situations always feel different, Jade replied, her voice carrying the weight of experience. The key is to maintain situational awareness, trust your training, and make decisions based on the safest outcomes rather than the most comfortable ones. The radio crackled again. Coastal 958, Jacksonville approach. We have runway 08 clear for emergency landing. Current winds 070 degrees at 12 knots, visibility 10 miles, ceiling 3,000 feet. Are you ready for approach briefing? Sterling looked at Jade, who nodded encouragingly. Jacksonville approach. Coastal 958 is ready for approach briefing. As Jacksonville provided detailed landing instructions, Jade noticed Sterling taking notes with the focused attention of someone determined to prove herself worthy of the responsibility she'd been given. The young first officer was rising to meet the challenge, supported by expertise she couldn't have developed on her own, but confident enough to maintain command authority. Approach looks straightforward, Jade said, after Jacksonville completed their briefing. Standard ILS approach with emergency vehicles standing by. The weather conditions are favorable, and you have the experience to execute this landing. Sterling nodded, then asked the question Jade had been expecting. Will you stay in the cockpit for the approach? If you want me here. But remember, this is your aircraft and your decision. I'm here to provide support, not to take over. As Flight 958 continued its descent toward Jacksonville, the cockpit atmosphere had transformed from desperate crisis management to professional cooperation. Sterling remained pilot in command, but she now had the expertise and experience that the emergency situation demanded.
In the passenger cabin, word had spread that military assistance was available in the cockpit, and the mood had shifted from panic to cautious optimism. Graham Sinclair was explaining to nearby passengers that the woman from row 18 had revealed herself to be a military pilot, while Penelope Ward clutched her cross necklace and whispered prayers of gratitude. Jade felt the familiar weight of command responsibility settling on her shoulders, but this time it felt different. Instead of the crushing burden of decisions that could cost lives, she was providing support that might save them. She wasn't making the tactical choices that had haunted her since Marcus Webb's death. She was helping another pilot make those choices successfully. Flight 958 was still in danger, but for the first time since Captain Fairbanks had collapsed, everyone aboard had reason to believe they might make it home.
As Flight 958 descended through 22,000 feet toward Jacksonville, what had seemed like a manageable emergency suddenly became something far more complex. The weather system they'd successfully navigated around was moving faster than predicted, and new storm cells were developing directly over their intended approach path. Coastal 958, Jacksonville approach? The radio crackled with urgent concern. We're showing rapid development of severe weather over the airport. Winds are now gusting to 45 knots with severe turbulence reported on final approach. We may need to divert you to an alternate airport. First Officer Sterling's face went pale as she processed the implications. Where's the nearest alternate? How much fuel do we have for extended flight? Jade quickly scanned the fuel management display, her military experience with fuel calculations kicking in automatically. We have approximately 45 minutes of fuel remaining at current consumption rates, less if we encounter headwinds or have to hold for extended periods. Jacksonville, what alternates are available? Sterling asked, her voice showing the first cracks of renewed stress. Coastal 958, your nearest suitable alternates are Orlando International at 95 miles southeast or Savannah Hilton Head at 110 miles northeast. Both are reporting better weather conditions, but Orlando is showing some convective activity moving in from the west. Sterling looked at Jade with growing desperation. Military training, what would you recommend? Jade studied the radar display, noting patterns that her years of tactical flying had taught her to recognize. The storm system was creating a pincer movement, with weather fronts converging from multiple directions. In military terms, they were being squeezed between advancing threats with limited escape routes. The weather is moving too fast for us to outrun it to either alternate, she said grimly. By the time we reach Orlando or Savannah, the storm systems will have closed those options too. And we don't have enough fuel for extended holding patterns. Dr. Hartwell looked up from Captain Fairbanks with additional bad news. Captain, his blood pressure is dropping. Whatever caused the stroke may be progressing. He needs immediate medical attention, not in an hour, not in 30 minutes, now. Sterling's hands began to shake as the weight of impossible choices settled on her shoulders. So, we can't wait for the weather to clear. We can't divert to alternates, and we can't land in conditions that could kill everyone on board. Coastal 958, Jacksonville approach, came another transmission. We're now reporting wind shear alerts on all approaches. A commercial aircraft attempted landing 5 minutes ago and had to execute a go-around due to severe turbulence. Recommend you consider holding until conditions improve. We can't hold, Sterling replied, her voice cracking under pressure. We have a medical emergency requiring immediate hospital treatment and insufficient fuel for extended delay. The silence that followed seemed to last forever before Jacksonville responded. Coastal 958, understand your situation. Be advised that current conditions are beyond recommended minimums for commercial aircraft operations. Any approach attempt will be at pilot discretion and considerable risk. Jade felt the familiar sensation of time slowing down that she remembered from combat situations when all options were bad and command decisions carried life or death consequences. She studied the radar display, noting wind patterns, precipitation intensity, and the narrow windows of opportunity that might exist between storm cells. There might be a way, she said quietly, her voice carrying the analytical tone she'd used when briefing high-risk military missions. Sterling turned to her with desperate hope. What kind of way? Jade pointed to the radar display.
The storm cells are moving in patterns that create brief windows of reduced wind shear. If we time our approach to coincide with those windows, we might be able to get through the worst conditions before they close again. Might? Dr. Hartwell asked sharply. Captain, we're talking about 247 lives here. Doctor, we're also talking about certain death if we run out of fuel or if Captain Fairbanks doesn't receive immediate medical attention. This isn't a choice between safe and dangerous. It's a choice between extremely dangerous and impossible. Sterling studied the approach charts, her commercial training warring with the desperate need to find any solution that might work. What exactly would this tactical approach involve, she asked. Steeper descent angle than normal commercial procedures, faster approach speed to minimize exposure time to wind shear, and manual flight control throughout the entire approach, instead of relying on autopilot systems that can't adapt quickly enough to rapidly changing conditions. Tactical approaches?
That sounds like something that requires years of specialized training, Sterling said, her voice carrying the weight of someone realizing they were being asked to attempt something beyond their capabilities. It does, Jade agreed, which is why I would need to take the controls for the approach. The words hit the cockpit like a physical blow. Ruby Fletcher, who had been monitoring the conversation, looked between the two pilots with obvious concern. Sterling's face showed a mixture of relief and terror at the prospect of turning over control of her aircraft to someone, regardless of their qualifications, who wasn't officially authorized to fly commercial aircraft. I can't... Regulations don't allow civilian passengers to pilot commercial aircraft, Sterling said weakly, grasping for procedural guidelines that seemed inadequate in their current situation. The regulations assume normal operating conditions with qualified crew available, Jade replied, gently but firmly. We're beyond normal conditions, and you have an incapacitated captain and a first officer who, through no fault of her own, lacks the specialized training needed for this specific type of emergency approach. Jacksonville Approach interrupted their discussion. Coastal 958, we're showing your fuel state as critical for any diversion attempts. What are your intentions? Sterling looked at Jade, then at the weather display showing storm cells that were continuing to intensify around Jacksonville. Captain Fairbanks lay unconscious beside them, his breathing showing signs of distress that Dr. Hartwell was monitoring with growing concern. If I turn over the controls to you, Sterling asked quietly, what are our chances? Jade considered the question with the brutal honesty that military service had taught her. In optimal conditions, with a fully qualified crew, I'd estimate this approach at about 60% probability of successful landing. With current weather, an incapacitated captain, and the stress factors we're dealing with, maybe 40%. And if we try to wait or divert, near zero. The weather is moving too fast and we don't have the fuel reserves for extended maneuvering. Dr. Hartwell spoke up from beside Captain Fairbanks. From a medical perspective, every minute we delay increases the probability of permanent brain damage or death for your captain. Stroke treatment is time critical. Sterling closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of command responsibility that Jade knew intimately from her military experience. When she opened them, her voice carried new resolve. Captain Blackwood, I'm requesting your assistance to pilot this aircraft for emergency landing approach. I'll remain as co-pilot to assist with communications and systems management. Jacksonville Approach, Coastal 958, we are declaring an emergency and requesting immediate clearance for approach to runway 08. Be advised we have military-qualified pilot assistance and are prepared to attempt approach in current conditions. Jacksonville Approach, Coastal 958, you are cleared for immediate approach runway 08. Emergency vehicles are standing by. Wind 080 degrees at 32 knots, gusting to 47. Visibility 3 miles in heavy rain. Report outer marker inbound. As Jade took the controls of the Boeing 777, she felt the familiar sensation of aircraft response that she remembered from thousands of hours in military cockpits. But this was different from any combat mission she'd ever flown. Instead of engaging enemy forces, she was battling weather systems that could prove just as deadly. Beginning approach descent, she announced, her voice carrying calm authority despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. All flight attendants prepare for emergency landing procedures. Through the cockpit windows, she could see the wall of storm clouds ahead, lit from within by lightning that illuminated the turbulence they would have to navigate.
Below them, 247 passengers were depending on her ability to do something that commercial aviation procedures said was impossible. The most dangerous part of the flight was about to begin.
The Boeing 777 shuddered violently as it entered the outer edge of the storm systems surrounding Jacksonville International Airport. Rain hammered against the cockpit windows with machine gun intensity, while lightning illuminated towering thunderheads that rose like mountains of superheated vapor around their approach path. Jade's hands moved across the controls with the fluid precision of someone who had navigated through hostile environments where hesitation meant death. But this was different from any combat mission she'd ever flown. Enemy missiles followed predictable physics. Weather systems were chaos made manifest, capable of changing direction and intensity without warning. "Outer marker, Coastal 958 inbound," she radioed to Jacksonville Tower, her voice steady despite the aircraft's violent motion through the turbulent air. "Coastal 958, Jacksonville Tower. You are cleared to land runway 08. Wind now 070 degrees at 38 knots, gusting to 52. Visibility 2 miles and heavy precipitation. Be advised we have 3 emergency vehicles standing by and medical personnel ready for your patient." In the right seat, First Officer Sterling monitored engine parameters and system status while trying to suppress the terror that came from watching someone attempt an approach that violated every safety protocol she'd been taught. "Airspeed is fluctuating wildly," she reported. "We're getting plus or minus 20 knots of variation." "That's normal in wind shear conditions," Jade replied, her military training allowing her to process multiple streams of data while maintaining focus on the primary task of keeping the aircraft controllable. The key is to fly the attitude and power settings, not chase the airspeed indicator. Through the storm-lashed windows, the airport was invisible except for brief moments when lightning illuminated the runway lights below. Jade was flying almost entirely on instruments, using her tactical training to interpret radar altitude, approach slope, and wind direction data in ways that commercial pilots rarely had to master. Dr. Hartwell's voice carried urgent concern from behind Captain Fairbanks. "His vital signs are deteriorating, blood pressure dropping, pulse becoming irregular. Whatever's happening in his brain, it's accelerating." The Boeing 777 dropped suddenly as it hit a downdraft, losing 300 feet of altitude in seconds before Jade could compensate with increased power and nose-up attitude. Airspeed alternation warnings screamed through the cockpit as they briefly descended below the minimum safe approach altitude. "Pull up! Pull up!" the automated voice system announced, adding its mechanical alarm to the chaos of wind, rain, and turbulence that surrounded them. "I've got it," Jade said firmly, her voice cutting through the cacophony of warning systems. Years of combat flying had taught her to trust her instruments and training, even when every natural instinct screamed that they were about to crash. Sterling watched the altitude tape with white knuckles as Jade brought the aircraft back to the approach glide path through sheer force of will and superior flying skills. "How did you know to compensate before the altitude alerts activated?" Tactical flying teaches you to read the subtle signs that precede major atmospheric disturbances. You learn to anticipate weather changes instead of just reacting to them. The radio crackled with an emergency transmission from Jacksonville Tower. "Coastal 958, we're showing you significantly below glide path. Are you able to maintain approach, or do you need to execute a missed approach?" Jade studied the approach display, calculating distances, fuel remaining, and the rapidly deteriorating weather conditions that would make a second approach attempt even more dangerous. They had perhaps one chance to get this right. If they missed the approach and had to go around, they wouldn't have enough fuel for another attempt. "Jacksonville Tower, Coastal 958, continuing approach. We're correcting for wind shear effects." But as they descended through 2,000 feet, conditions worsened beyond anything Jade had experienced even in military operations. The aircraft was being tossed around like a toy, with vertical accelerations that would have been impossible to maintain in sustained combat maneuvering. "Jade," Sterling said, using her first name for the first time, "the structural load indicators are approaching red line values. The aircraft wasn't designed for this level of turbulence." Jade glanced at the structural load displays, noting that the Boeing 777's airframe was indeed being pushed beyond normal design parameters. In military aircraft, she would have had ejection seats as a final escape option.
Here, there was no backup plan if the aircraft broke apart under the extreme stress. "We're committed now," Jade said grimly. "Going around would put even more stress on the airframe, and we don't have the fuel for it anyway." Through the storm, the first glimpse of runway lights appeared like distant stars through the chaos. But they were offset from the aircraft's current heading, indicating that wind conditions were pushing them sideways despite Jade's constant corrections.
"I can see the runway," Sterling reported, "but we're drifting left of centerline." "I see it," Jade replied, banking the aircraft into the crosswind with a technique that would have been impossible without her military training in precision flying under extreme conditions. "This is going to be a manual landing all the way to touchdown. Autopilot systems can't compensate fast enough for these wind variations." At 500 feet above the runway, the aircraft hit the most severe turbulence yet, a microburst that created contradictory wind currents from multiple directions simultaneously. The Boeing 777 pitched nose down violently, while rolling left, threatening to enter an unrecoverable attitude at low altitude. For a terrifying moment, it seemed certain that Flight 958 would impact the ground short of the runway. Sterling's hands moved instinctively toward her controls, but she stopped herself, recognizing that Jade's superior experience was their only hope of survival. Jade's response was instantaneous and precise. Maximum power to all engines, full nose-up elevator input, and aileron corrections that brought the aircraft back to stable flight attitude just 200 feet above the ground. The maneuver required split-second timing and perfect coordination that demonstrated why military pilots trained for years to develop such reflexes. "How did you do that?" Sterling gasped, her voice barely audible above the continuing storm noise. "Practice," Jade replied tersely, all her attention focused on the final approach phase. Lots and lots of practice in conditions where failure wasn't an option. At 500 feet above the runway, the aircraft hit the most severe turbulence yet. The wind shear effects began to diminish as they descended below the worst of the storm activity. But they were approaching the runway at an angle that would require last-second corrections to align with the centerline. 50 feet, Sterling called out, reading the radar altimeter. 40. 30. Jade could see the runway lights directly ahead now, but the aircraft was still fighting crosswind effects that threatened to push them off the paved surface. She made final control inputs that combined her military precision flying experience with desperate improvisation. 20 feet. 10 feet. The Boeing 777's main landing gear touched down hard on the Jacksonville runway with an impact that sent shockwaves through the entire aircraft. But they were down, alive, and decelerating rapidly as Jade deployed thrust reversers and maximum braking. "We're on the ground!" Sterling shouted with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "We actually made it!" But the landing was only the beginning of their challenges. Emergency vehicles were racing toward them across the rain-soaked tarmac, their red and blue lights cutting through the storm like beacons of salvation. Captain Fairbanks needed immediate medical attention, and 247 passengers needed to be safely evacuated from an aircraft that had been pushed beyond its design limits. As the Boeing 777 rolled to a stop on the Jacksonville runway, Jade felt the familiar aftermath of combat missions, the combination of physical exhaustion and psychological relief that came from surviving something that should have been impossible. She had brought them home, against all odds, in conditions that exceeded every safety protocol in commercial aviation. She had guided 247 souls through a storm that could have killed them all. But the real test would be what happened next, when the investigation began and questions were asked about how a retired military pilot had ended up flying a commercial airliner through weather conditions that professional pilots had declared impossible. The Boeing 777 came to a complete stop, engines spooling down to idle as emergency crews surrounded the aircraft. Through the cockpit windows, Jade could see medical personnel racing toward them with equipment to treat Captain Fairbanks. They had landed. But in many ways, the hardest part was just beginning.
The Jacksonville International Airport tarmac became a scene of controlled chaos as emergency vehicles surrounded Flight 958. Red and blue lights painted the rain-soaked asphalt in urgent colors, while medical personnel rushed toward the aircraft with equipment designed to save Captain Leonard Fairbanks' life. But inside the cockpit, a different kind of urgency was unfolding as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Jacksonville ground, Coastal 958 is safely on the ground at gate position, First Officer Sterling radioed, her voice carrying exhaustion and relief in equal measure. We need immediate medical assistance for our captain and request priority deplaning for all passengers. Coastal 958, Jacksonville ground, medical personnel are en route to your aircraft. Emergency vehicles are standing by, and we have gate agents ready to assist with passenger evacuation. Outstanding work bringing your aircraft down safely in those conditions. Jade sat in the left seat, her hands still gripping the controls as adrenaline slowly ebbed from her system. The Boeing 777's engines were spooling down to idle, but she could still feel the echo of turbulence in her body, the physical memory of forces that had pushed both aircraft and pilot beyond normal operational limits. Dr. Hartwell was already preparing Captain Fairbanks for transfer to the medical team. His vital signs have stabilized somewhat, but he needs immediate hospital treatment. The fact that we got him on the ground this quickly may have saved his life. Through the cockpit windows, Jade could see emergency medical technicians approaching with stretchers and advanced life support equipment. But she could also see something else that made her stomach clench with familiar dread. News crews and airport officials who would inevitably want answers about how a commercial aircraft had been piloted through impossible weather conditions by someone who wasn't officially authorized to fly it. Captain Blackwood, Sterling said quietly, using the military rank that somehow felt appropriate despite their civilian circumstances. I need to ask you something before the investigators arrive. Jade turned to look at the young first officer, whose aircraft she had essentially commandeered during the emergency. What do you need to know? Are you going to be in trouble for this? I mean, legally, professionally, I know you saved our lives, but the regulations are pretty clear about unauthorized personnel operating commercial aircraft. The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither pilot had had time to consider during the crisis. Jade had violated numerous federal aviation regulations by taking control of a commercial airliner, regardless of her qualifications or the circumstances that had made it necessary. Probably, Jade replied honestly. The FAA doesn't typically make exceptions for emergency situations when it comes to unauthorized flight operations. But that's not your concern right now. You made the right decision under impossible circumstances, and you did everything by the book. Ruby Fletcher appeared in the cockpit doorway, her professional composure showing cracks after the ordeal they'd all survived. The passengers are asking to thank whoever landed the aircraft. They know something extraordinary happened, and they want to express their gratitude. Before Jade could respond, the cockpit radio crackled with a transmission that would change everything. Coastal Airways Flight 958. This is Colonel Patricia Hayes, United States Air Force Operations Center. We monitored your emergency landing and have been in contact with FAA headquarters regarding the circumstances of your flight operations. Jade felt her military bearing automatically straighten as she recognized the authority in the transmission. Colonel Hayes, this is Captain Jade Blackwood, retired. I assisted with emergency flight operations under civilian pilot command. Captain Blackwood, we have your military service record and flight qualifications on file. The Secretary of Transportation has been briefed on your actions today, and there are some people who would like to speak with you about both your performance and your current situation. Sterling looked at Jade with confusion. What does that mean? The cockpit door opened wider as airport officials and FAA investigators began to arrive, but they were accompanied by individuals in military uniforms whose presence suggested this incident had attracted attention at levels far above routine emergency response. Captain Blackwood, said a woman in an Air Force uniform with colonel's insignia, I'm Colonel Hayes. We've been monitoring your situation, and I have instructions to inform you that your actions today demonstrate exactly the kind of expertise the Air Force needs in our current pilot shortage. Jade stared at the colonel, processing implications she hadn't expected. Ma'am, I retired from active duty 3 years ago. My situation with command responsibilities and other issues led to my decision to separate from military service. Captain, we've reviewed your service record, including the incident reports from your final deployment. Your tactical decisions saved 37 civilian lives while operating under conditions that would have challenged any pilot. The review board's assessment was that you demonstrated exceptional judgment under extreme pressure. The words hit Jade like a physical blow. For 3 years, she had carried the guilt of Marcus Webb's death, believing that her command decisions had been flawed, that her judgment couldn't be trusted with lives under her responsibility. "But Lieutenant Webb died because of my tactical choices," she said quietly. "Lieutenant Webb died because he was following lawful orders in a combat situation where all alternatives involved significant risk," Colonel Hayes replied firmly. "The after-action review concluded that your decisions saved far more lives than were lost, and that any other course of action would have resulted in greater casualties." Dr. Hartwell interrupted from beside Captain Fairbanks. "Excuse me, but we need to move the patient immediately. His condition requires emergency intervention that can't wait for debriefing sessions." As medical personnel entered the cockpit to transfer Captain Fairbanks, Jade found herself face to face with the consequences of her decision to reveal her capabilities. Airport officials needed statements about the unauthorized flight operations. FAA investigators required detailed accounts of emergency procedures. And military personnel were offering opportunities she had never expected to receive again. But more importantly, she could hear voices from the passenger cabin. 247 people who were alive because she had made the choice to step forward when someone with her skills was needed. Graham Sinclair appeared in the cockpit doorway, his usual arrogance completely absent. "I don't know your name or your background, but I want you to know that everyone on this aircraft understands what you did for us today. You saved our lives when nobody else could." Behind him, Penelope Ward held her cross necklace with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said simply. "My granddaughter is getting married next month, and I'm going to be there because of you." One by one, passengers appeared to express their gratitude to the woman who had guided them through impossible conditions. Business travelers, families with children, elderly couples, and young adults, all of them united by the shared experience of surviving something that should have killed them. Ruby Fletcher wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the impromptu gratitude session. "In 15 years of flying, I've never seen anything like what you accomplished today. The crew of Flight 958 owes you a debt we can never repay." First Officer Sterling stood beside her aircraft controls, watching Jade interact with passengers and officials. She had one more question when there was a brief lull in the conversations. "Would you consider coming back to aviation? Because after today, I think there are a lot of people who would benefit from your experience and expertise." Jade looked around the cockpit that had become the center of her personal transformation. 3 hours ago, she had been running from her military identity, trying to find a civilian purpose that felt meaningful. Now, she was surrounded by people whose lives had been saved by the very skills and judgment she had been convinced were flawed. Colonel Hayes approached with documentation that would formalize discussions about Jade's potential return to military service. FAA investigators prepared to conduct interviews that would determine whether criminal charges would be filed for unauthorized flight operations. Airport officials coordinated with media personnel who were documenting what was already being called one of the most remarkable emergency landings in aviation history. But what mattered most to Jade was the realization that running from responsibility hadn't solved anything. The skills that had cost Marcus Webb his life had also saved 247 others. The judgment she had questioned for 3 years had proven sound when tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable. As Captain Leonard Fairbanks was carefully transferred to a waiting ambulance, his vital signs stable and his chances for recovery dramatically improved by the rapid medical response, Jade understood that she had found something she hadn't been looking for: redemption. Not the kind that came from avoiding difficult situations, but the kind that came from stepping forward when people needed someone with her capabilities, regardless of personal cost or bureaucratic consequences. Flight 958 had landed safely, but Captain Jade Blackwood's real journey was just beginning. 6 months after Flight 958,
Captain Jade Blackwood stood on the tarmac at Jacksonville International Airport, watching a Coastal Airways Boeing 777 taxi toward the terminal in perfect weather conditions. The same runway where she had landed during that harrowing storm now gleamed in afternoon sunshine, a testament to how dramatically circumstances could change with time and perspective. The FAA investigation had concluded 3 weeks earlier with a determination that while technical regulations had been violated, the extraordinary circumstances and successful outcome warranted no criminal prosecution. Instead, Jade had been granted an emergency commercial pilot certification that recognized her military qualifications and authorized her transition to civilian aviation operations. "Captain Blackwood," came a familiar voice behind her. She turned to see First Officer Ava Sterling approaching, wearing the crisp uniform of a newly promoted captain. Sterling had been fast-tracked through captain training after her performance during the emergency, her experience with crisis management making her exactly the kind of pilot airlines needed. "Captain Sterling," Jade replied with a smile, noting how the young woman carried herself with new confidence. "How does it feel to have your own aircraft?" "Terrifying and wonderful," Sterling admitted, "but I keep thinking about what you told me during the emergency, that the key is making decisions based on the safest outcomes rather than the most comfortable ones. It's changed how I approach every aspect of flying." They walked together toward the terminal, past the memorial plaque that had been installed to commemorate the crew and passengers of Flight 958. The inscription read, "In recognition of extraordinary courage and professional excellence under impossible conditions, demonstrating that heroism is found not in seeking glory, but in accepting responsibility when lives depend on it." "Have you heard from any of the passengers recently?" Sterling asked. Jade nodded, pulling out her phone to show recent messages. Penelope Ward sends pictures from her granddaughter's wedding. Graham Sinclair, believe it or not, has become one of my strongest advocates in the aerospace consulting community. Even Dr. Hartwell writes occasionally with updates on Captain Fairbanks's recovery. Leonard Fairbanks had made a remarkable recovery from his stroke, aided by the rapid medical response that their emergency landing had made possible. He'd returned to limited flight duties as an instructor pilot, his experience during the medical emergency giving him unique insights into crisis management training. "And the military offer?" Sterling asked, referring to Colonel Hayes's proposal for Jade to return to active duty as a flight training instructor. "I turned it down. Not because I don't value military service, but because I realized my purpose isn't about returning to my old identity. It's about using my experience to help others in whatever capacity serves the greater good." Instead, Jade had accepted a position with the National Transportation Safety Board as a specialist in emergency procedures and pilot training. Her unique combination of military experience and recent civilian crisis management made her invaluable in developing new protocols for situations that traditional training hadn't addressed. "Speaking of helping others," Sterling said with a grin, "I heard about your new project with the Aviation Safety Foundation." Jade's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "We're developing training programs that incorporate military tactical decision-making into civilian emergency procedures. The goal is to prepare commercial pilots for situations that go beyond normal protocols, exactly the kind of scenarios where hesitation can be fatal." The program, called Crisis Command Training, was already being implemented by major airlines across the country. Jade's experience with Flight 958 had demonstrated that traditional commercial aviation training, while excellent for routine operations, sometimes left pilots unprepared for truly extraordinary circumstances. "The best part," Jade continued, "is that we're not just teaching flying techniques, we're teaching decision-making under pressure, leadership during chaos, and how to accept responsibility when everything depends on your choices." As they entered the terminal, Jade noticed a familiar figure waiting near the departure gates. Ruby Fletcher, the flight attendant from Flight 958, approached with her characteristic professional smile, now enhanced by genuine warmth. "Captain Blackwood, I was hoping to catch you before your flight to Washington." Ruby had been promoted to chief flight attendant after her exemplary performance during the emergency, and she'd become an advocate for enhanced crew training programs. "Ruby, good to see you. How's the new position treating you?"
Challenging, but rewarding. I'm actually implementing some of the crew coordination techniques you suggested. The idea that flight attendants should be trained to recognize and communicate critical situations to pilots has already proven valuable in several incidents. Their conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the terminal's public address system. Flight 447 to Tampa, now boarding at Gate 12. Flight 447 to Tampa, now boarding at Gate 12. Jade checked her boarding pass. Flight 447, the same route she'd been taking 6 months earlier when her life had changed forever. But this time, she wasn't running from her past or trying to find purpose in an uncertain civilian future. She was traveling to Washington, D.C., to brief congressional committees on aviation safety improvements and pilot training protocols. As she prepared to board, Sterling asked one final question. Do you ever regret revealing your background that day? You could have stayed anonymous, avoided all the investigation and media attention. Jade considered the question as she watched passengers boarding the aircraft. Families traveling together, business people focused on their laptops, elderly couples holding hands as they navigated the terminal. Ordinary people trusting that the crew would bring them safely to their destinations. No, she said finally. For 3 years, I thought avoiding responsibility was the same as avoiding failure. But what I learned on Flight 958 is that real failure comes from having the ability to help and choosing not to act. Marcus Webb didn't die because of my command decisions. He died serving something larger than himself, just like we all have to do when lives are at stake. Ruby Fletcher nodded thoughtfully. You know, the passengers from Flight 958 still stay in touch with each other. Graham Sinclair started a group chat, if you can believe that. They call themselves the Phoenix Squadron, after your old call sign. The name hit Jade with unexpected emotion. Phoenix, the mythical bird that rose from ashes to fly again. She'd earned that call sign in military training, lost faith in it after Webb's death, and rediscovered its meaning in the cockpit of a civilian airliner during the worst storm of her life. They want to have a reunion, all the passengers and crew who were aboard that day. They're calling it a second chance celebration, honoring not just the fact that we survived, but that we all found new purposes afterward. As Jade boarded Flight 447, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that morning 6 months ago, when she had just been another passenger trying to escape her military identity. Now she was traveling to the nation's capital to share expertise that could save lives, developing training programs that would prepare future pilots for impossible situations, and serving as an advocate for the kind of courage that stepped forward when stepping back would be safer. The flight attendant checking boarding passes looked up as Jade approached. Captain Blackwood, I'm Sarah Martinez, and I just wanted to say I've read about what you did on Flight 958. You're the reason I decided to pursue additional emergency training. Thank you for showing us what real leadership looks like. As Flight 447 pushed back from the gate, Jade looked out the window at Jacksonville International Airport, where her new life had truly begun. The runway that had once seemed like a destination now looked like a launching point, a place where she'd discovered that running from responsibility wasn't freedom, it was just another kind of prison. Her phone buzzed with a message from Penelope Ward. Saw you on the news talking about pilot training programs. My granddaughter says she wants to be a pilot like the lady who saved Grandma's life. You're still making a difference, dear. Jade smiled and settled into her seat as Flight 447 climbed toward cruising altitude. Below them, the ground fell away to reveal the endless sky that had always been her true home. But now she understood something she hadn't known as a young fighter pilot. The sky wasn't just a place to demonstrate technical skill or prove personal courage. It was a place where people trusted each other with their lives, where decisions mattered more than recognition, and where true heroism was measured not by the glory received, but by the responsibility accepted when everything was on the line.
Captain Jade Blackwood was flying toward a future where her past had finally found its purpose, and where the phoenix had truly risen from the ashes to soar again. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.